Good morning, colleagues. The Committee of the Whole is now called to order. Before we recess on Friday, we're still on Senator Frank Uggan's amendment. Senator Morrison, you had the floor before we broke. Did you have any other amendment or anything else on the Uggan amendment? You're good? Okay. Are there anyone else who has any? Senator San Nicolas, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question for the mover of the amendment. The current law has it where when the governor is off island, the lieutenant governor assumes the role of acting governor. Will the acting governor, in his capacity, be able to exercise the powers of this reorganization if the governor is not present on the island?
Senator Uggan, do you yield to the question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that question. It really is a question that a legal mind should be able to respond to, but my understanding, based on how the Organic Act is written, that there is that particular authority extended.
Senator San Nicolas, any other questions? Thank you very much. Any other senator have any questions or have any amendments for the Uggan amendment? Senator Tamata, you recognize?
I guess maybe if the author of the amendment can just help to clarify. So I guess what we're doing is we are repealing existing policies regarding government reorganization with this new amendment here, which I presume is intended to remove a lot of the red tape so that reorganization can be done more expeditiously. And so, then in order to be able to achieve that, then a lot of the, I guess, checks and balances and protections for the employees have to be removed so that there's, so that we can move about without the kinds of red tapes. You can call it red tapes or checks and balances. So maybe if the mover of this amendment can kind of clarify what are we doing here actually? We're repealing an existing policy, replacing it with something else. And what is it that we're trying to achieve? Again, I really need to understand that more clearly.
Senator Uggan, you yield to the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that question, Senator. Senator, if we can recall during the course of the public hearing, one of the comments was mentioned is that there are certain provisions in law today that make it extremely difficult and at times pose an impediment to any reorganization of the government of Guam. One is the privatization, the other one is the actual reorganization provisions, and then the consolidation. So you look at some of these provisions, we are reestablishing a provision that would empower or provide the authority which already the governor of Guam presently has in the Organic Act. But because of these laws that constrain any extensive reorganization of the government of Guam, what this would provide is that opportunity and that authority for the governor of Guam through this amendment, should it pass, recognizing that education, public safety, and healthcare are priorities, and that we need to look at streamlining. And Senator, there's one phrase that you used, and that is certainly cutting the red tape. We need to allow the governor of Guam the authority to be able to cut the red tape and ensure that we streamline government services, and that in the same token, emphasize the priority of education, public safety, and healthcare. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that explanation. I guess the red tape that we're trying to eliminate, might one interpret that as protections for the employees that would be impacted by reorganization? I'm not getting into a debate. I'm just trying to clarify in my mind here.
Senator Uggan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator. Senator, there's existing provisions that have not been extracted or deleted, or the proposal is not to delete those particular provisions, and one of them is the Public Employees Management Relations Act, because our permanent employees certainly have to be given due process in regards to any action by the Governor of Guam as it applies to their permanent employment.
So then we're removing those protections.
No, those are not referenced here, and those will still remain in law.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Abbott. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our clerk's staff is just making copies of an amendment that I'd like to proffer, and this is regard to subsection 2205 of the Uggan Amendment. And if we could just take a brief recess so it can be circulated.
Okay, we're in brief recess. Okay, we're back on. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, colleagues. I think, Senator, the mover of this amendment has been very clear about reiterating that he believes, and I think every member of this body believes, that our government needs to prioritize education, healthcare, and public safety of our people. And so this amendment is an amendment to subsection 2205 regarding the transfer authority. And the amendment reads, the governor is authorized to transfer the appropriation and any cost savings, unspent appropriation, or excess spending authority of any agency of the government which is abolished, or any function which is absorbed, to any other agency or agencies of the government with a PN of 100 to 107. So basically the intent of my amendment to the amendment would be to ensure that if agencies that come under group 3 of this reorganization plan, that the amount of money and the appropriation to those particular groups or agencies be used for our priorities, which again are healthcare, public safety, and education. We need to ensure that those things are funded first, that we provide those services to our people, and they truly are the priority of this government. And so that's what this amendment is attempting to do. Sujos Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. On Senator Lee's amendment, are there any senators who have any questions? Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized.
I just wanted to inquire of the mover of the amendment. I don't see any references to education, health, or public safety in this amendment. Do I have the wrong copy, or is this the amendment here?
I'm happy to yield to that
Yes,
question.
Senator?
Yeah, actually, in the original amendment, all of those big 3 items are listed under PN 100 to 107. So they're in group 1. So I believe education, healthcare, and public safety. So the hospital, Department of Education, and our public safety agencies are all indicated with a PN of either 100 to 107. And so all of those 3 entities are covered under that.
At the end.
So it's PN 100 to 107.
Okay.
Senator San Nicolas, you're good. Thank you very much. Anyone else on Senator Lee's amendment? Senator Espadon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, last Friday, when we were going through this amendment, one of the amendments that was adopted and approved by this body was the addition or the replacement, the taking of Public Defender Service Corporation from Group 3 into Group 1. And right now, bottom line, if this amendment needs to be amended to include that, bottom line, because if we go without changing the PN of 100 to 107, technically, the Public Defender Service Corporation is not included in that. So what I would like to do is make an amendment to the amendment to include something, maybe Public Defenders now becomes 108 because of the addition to priority group number 1. And so 107 perhaps should be 108 or perhaps the wording should be something more of anything in group 1. And I'm not really sure what the real verbiage should be, but again, by our actions last Friday, to limit it to just 100 to 107 doesn't cover the Public Defender Service Corporation.
Okay, thank you, Senator Espadon. So the amendment to the amendment is to ensure that the Department of, or the Public Defender is included in this amendment of Senator Lee, and perhaps if we can get the legal counsel to, if we all understand what that amendment is, to have legal counsel make that, provide us that language. But if the body would agree to it, but that's, and we understand that's the gist of his amendment. Yes, the amendment we had last week. Okay. Are there any objections to this? No objections? Senator Ada? Yeah. Okay, motion carries. Thank you, Senator Espadon. Okay. Anyone? Senator San Agustin, and then the Vice Speaker.
Mr. Chair, I just have a question for the author of the amendment. Were there any bills or any public laws that exist today that talks about reorganization of the government that have not taken place? Are you aware if there's anything, any bill that was passed that's now public law that directs that the government should have gone through a reorganization process? And the reason why I asked is because I was approached by a former senator that said, Bill, I think it's Public Law 2902, but I'm just trying to dig it up. But I'm just wondering if there is a public law that directs the reorganization that has not taken place, should have taken place, and that I have no objection to your bill because you're the author of the bill. Didn't they pass?
Okay, can we dispose of Senator Lee's amendment, and then Senator, we'll come back to this.
Okay, I have no objection to
Okay,
hers.
thank you very much, Senator. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, last Friday also, I believe that we also adopted an amendment to strike Section 5 in terms of the requirement of approval by the legislature for privatization. And I just want to make sure, am I correct on that one? That amendment was passed on the privatization?
Senator, can you please repeat that?
Last Friday, I believe that one of our colleagues made a motion to delete Section 5, which is relative to privatization.
Oh yeah, that was.
And,
Yes, that's correct,
right, we
Senator.
did. And so, just correspondingly, under Section 2209, under item number D, again, it speaks to privatization. And since we had adopted that amendment, then I would imagine that Section D under 2209 needs to be struck also.
Okay, if we can come back to that, Senator.
Oh, I'm
And
sorry.
we're
That's right.
on
We're
the
still
Lee
on the
amendment.
amendment. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
okay. We're still on the Lee amendment. Anyone else wish to speak on the Lee amendment? Senator, Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was my understanding that this bill, this amendment, the whole point of it was to allow this type of transfer to occur. In fact, the bill outlines how employees from an agency that's going to be absorbed or closed will be put on a list and potentially hired by the other agencies who might be absorbing that function, or just might be put on a, trying to see what they call that list, availability roster on 2208. So that's what happens with the employees. And then it proposes in 2205 that the appropriation of that agency which is abolished, or any function which is absorbed, that would also be transferred by the governor. And then in 2210, it talks about transferring all the other files and equipment of these agencies that are either being absorbed or abolished. And so, I don't see any harm in the amendment, but I think the provisions that already exist are satisfactory, and I just hope that this amendment doesn't maybe add another layer of issues to deal with. But it looks consistent to me, so I guess I have no objection to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Senator Tomata, did you have something? Oh, I'm sorry. Anyone else have any questions on the Lee amendment? Are there any objections to the Lee amendment? There are no objections. Motion carries. Senator Lee, you still have the floor.
That's all.
You're good.
Thank you.
Senator Spadon, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, just to reiterate, since we struck the provision dealing with privatization, then to be consistent, I move that we delete the word privatization under section 2209, subsection D.
Okay. Are there any objections to the senator's motion to delete subsection D on 2209? No objections? Motion carried. Yes, Senator Lee. Senator, can you please repeat your motion? You're good. Okay, she's fine. Are there any objections to the deletion of subsection D on 2209? No. D, privatization. No objections. Motion carries. Senator?
Thank you. And then I do have a question to the mover of the amendment. Under section 2211, 2211, abolished entity, an abolished entity shall be closed and all remaining personnel terminated within 60 days of the day of the entity was designated as an abolished entity. Since we're giving the governor, this amendment proposes to give the governor broad authority to reorganize, and including the abolishment of an entity, the 60 days, I guess, because of the general attorney's opinion that said there really is a process that needs to be followed, and I believe really the minimum amount of days was 90 days. And so this 60 days, I need to try to understand whether that's consistent with the opinion of the Attorney General.
Senator Uggan, would you yield to that?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Senator, for that question. Senator, if you want it to be applicable and consistent with the Attorney General's identified timeline of 90 days, it's certainly amenable to an amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I would need at least a minute, and you can probably go on with the discussion, but I need to address that with legal counsel. I'm not sure that the wording would be consistent with legal counsel, but really consistent with existing law. And so on that issue, I reserve the right to come back to introduce that amendment to make it consistent with public law in terms of, or the rules and regs, the administrative rules and regs, so that we're not creating a law that bypasses really the proper way to, if we are to terminate employees, the proper notice and the proceedings to follow. So I reserve the right to come back on that amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We'll come back to you on that.
Thank you.
Are there anyone else on the Uggan amendment? Senator San Agustin, yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just back to, for the author. is there any current public law that exists that directs the governor to do any reorganization? Is there any public laws today? And if there is, why didn't it take place, and why isn't that being applied? Because I have no objections to his amendment. I just wanted to know if there's anything that does exist.
Senator Uggan, or maybe the Vice Speaker?
Yes, if you don't mind. If you look at Section 8 of the bill, 5 GCA Chapter 11, these are the current laws that are in place that dictate or direct government reorganization, and it pretty much requires that a public hearing and what's going to happen to the classified employees and legislative approval for reorganization. So this definitely pushed even older laws for reorganization and set out the parameters of that reorganization. I think there's another provision in here that's also being, well, that's the main one, I think, that definitely put in statute the procedures for reorganization of the government. Thank you.
Senator, does that answer your question?
Okay, so then, based on this amendment, this basically repeals all those laws, and we move forward with this immediate reorganization, correct? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else on the Uggan amendment? Senator Esteves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to preface this with that there's an amendment pending with the clerks right now, but I'm going to go ahead and make the introduction to my colleagues. And the amendment that I'm proposing is to move from priority group 3 or 300, items 307 and 308, Commission on Decolonization and Department of Chamorro Affairs, to be moved up to priority group 2, to be established in any order as new items 214 and 215. Mr. Chairman, I'll admit I didn't catch this the first time, and in reviewing the measure on the amendment before us today, I did capture it. And the reason I make this case is for the simple fact that although we've been in a financial fiscal crisis for the last couple of months, Mr. Chairman, indigenous culture and the indigenous language have been in crisis for over 100 years, and many would argue much longer. I truly believe it's a priority of the government of Guam to ensure that indigenous protections and cultural promotion remain a top priority of this government. Mr. Chairman, you don't go to Japan and tell the Japanese government that Japanese culture and society and language isn't important. You don't go to the Philippines and tell the Philippine government that Filipino culture and language is not important, or China. Guam and the Marianas is the focal point of Chamorro culture, Chamorro society, Chamorro language. And it's been ignored and under-prioritized for such a long time. And when I thought about it this weekend, over the weekend, Mr. Chairman, the thought that without blinking an eye, we're prepared to put Chamorro affairs and issues of decolonization on the chopping block to save a buck. Without blinking an eye, without giving it a second thought. And I thought it's very important, and we have a responsibility to identify this. I understand everything can be argued, whether it's important or not, Mr. Chairman. But I believe as elected officials, it's very, very, very important that we don't set a precedent and we don't send a message out there that on the island of Guam, that Chamorro affairs and issues of decolonization aren't a priority of this government. And they should always be a priority of this government. So I do ask my colleagues that they support the amendment, which should be printed out now. And it's a simple amendment of moving those two agencies from priority group 3 to priority group 2.
Thank you, Senator. On the amendment to move the Commission on Decolonization and 308, is that correct? Department of Agriculture,
309, Mr. Chairman.
309,
Department of Chamorro Affairs.
to Group 2. On the Esteves amendment, are there any discussions? Senator Ogden, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that suggestion, but I'm going to have to oppose the proposed amendment. I know that part of the justification is the Commission on Decolonization, but if you take a look at the structure today, my understanding is that there's only one solo staff in the Commission on Decolonization, and that's the Executive Director. And prior to the incumbent governor, the Commission on Decolonization was almost non-existent, if not non-existent. So the whole purpose behind this, Mr. Chairman, and to the mover of the amendment, is to make sure that we give the governor the authority to be able to reorganize, to pull resources, whether it's funding, whether it's personnel, to pull resources so that should the governor make a decision that continues to be a fundamental function of this government, then pooling resources and consolidating and saving funds to advocate for that particular function or service certainly is going to benefit that entire process. So I look at it, and especially it's a very good question, but I prefer, at least from my perspective, Mr. Chairman, the focus has always got to be on the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is being able to cut the red tape, streamline this government, and continue to provide the resources in the areas that we know are priorities in this government. And I agree that the Chamorro language and culture is a fundamental component of this community, but by virtue of pooling resources into another entity, it may provide, or it will result in additional funding and resources for this particular service. So I have to oppose the proposed amendment to reevaluate the priority number listing of those particular entities. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Ogden. On the Esteves amendment, are there any other discussions? There is an objection. Anyone else? Any discussion? Okay. It's just to move the Commission on Decolonization and Department of Chamorro Affairs to Group 2. That's correct, Senator. Any other discussions? Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the mover of this amendment. It really does highlight for everyone what this amendment really will do for the government of Guam. And it's a huge change, really, as to how the government of Guam has worked for generations. And so the entire amendment to allow the governor to single-handedly reorganize all the agencies that have been put in place over decades, and the priorities that have pretty much been set by those before us, for many, many years. And, it's very tempting to say, let's give all this power to one person to do this by himself, because when we are in times like this, we need swift action, and it's very tempting to remove all the political debate. The problem with removing the political debate, however, and I think that's why, the wisdom of prior legislatures, they put some restraint on reorganization of the government, and they require very much that public hearings be had, and that the legislature either, they have an opportunity to stop that reorganization if it wanted to. If it determined that the priorities of the people were not being served. And because allowing one person to do it, or one branch by itself, without those type of protections of of public hearings and the legislature at least having a look at it, it removes that check and balance. And this is what we talk about when we talk about check and balance. It's very hard for a legislature to set the priorities of a governor. And I think, it's so very obvious to all of us, especially now, that we cannot make a governor prioritize something, the way we necessarily want him to in his actions. But our best attempt at it is in funding. And so I just think that it's been very clear that those before us have put their money where they thought the priorities were. They've established agencies. I think many times these agencies were established by law because they saw that governors did not prioritize these things. Whereas the rest of the community knew that these things, they must be part of what makes Guam, or what Guam government is going to do. And it is very hard, I think, to just kind of turn our backs. I mean, we can make this, the two that the sponsor of the amendment to the amendment have pointed out are of course very dear to my heart. And I don't think, we want to hope that there's no governor that's going to really truly deprioritize those things. But, we've actually seen that governors have actually paid very little attention to some of these things if they weren't really forced to. So that's the issue. And of course, I'm hoping that that will not be the issue going forward. But I have to say, and this is just me, but in looking at what has transpired in the last maybe 30 days, when we think we know that, what the priorities of the government are going to be, I think the people have been put into fear that the government does not prioritize what they think should be prioritized, such as safety and public health. And so this is, of course, it's going to take all of us to work together, I think, to make sure that we prioritize these things. I think a very similar argument could be made for, why was any of these agencies established? And that was because, we wanted these things to be set in stone, right? That no governor could ignore them. And that the people of Guam, and it's our history, we want that to be set in stone so that when future generations look back, they know what our priorities were. It's very clear that we made our best efforts to preserve our culture and to, and maybe even some of these other agencies that are going to be taken off. But it's just that, it's today we are looking at a governor who's threatening furloughs, layoffs, reduced hours, and we want to force him, I think, or encourage him to look at other excesses in the government that could be removed without necessarily impacting the lives of the classified employees, the safety of our villages, and it's a lot of trust that we're going to be putting into our governors, and we just have to hope that they're part of our community and that they're going to do what they feel they need to do at that moment. But I think the hope I have is that the whole amendment that allows this reorganization, it requires that the AAA process will be conformed to. And I thank the sponsor for putting that in there, that before it says the governor in 2209, the governor shall by executive order promulgate rules to accomplish the following. And so to accomplish the abolition of an agency, he's supposed to set forth some rules to accomplish the reorganization, the availability rosters, the outsourcing, furlough, layoff. So I'm not sure how these rules are going to differ from the rules that we've already have in place, but I expect that they are going to change timelines. And so I think that the AAA process, I'm hoping the AAA process will give us and the public a little bit of opportunity to at least know of what rules are going to be put in place for these things, and give because of the nature of the AAA process, give the legislature just a little bit more input as to the final product. But I share the sentiments of the mover of this amendment to the amendment, that it's a really sad day for us if we are going to, if I'm just hoping it's not going to happen, right? Or that we can stop paying an executive director $95,000. That I totally agree with. And we can, reorganize these agencies so that they are efficient and that they are not just, I just hope we're not going to see that the mission, that the service that's supposed to be provided is going to be removed entirely from our history, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker, for that. On the Esteves Amendment, Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'm not opposed to the amendment to prioritize the defense of our Chamorro language and culture, but I just want to encourage our colleagues. We could sit here again another 2 hours and 4 hours. We spent, 2 hours last week? We're talking about the reorganization provision, which I have significant reservations about. But for the sake of coming together to some sort of compromise, cutting, we can cut and cut and cut. I mean, I can go on and pontificate about the importance of Guam EPA in terms of it being a regulatory agency to protect the environment. But I'm afraid we're going to go 4 and 8 and 12 hours around the Uggan Amendment and never get really to what the issue is. Every hour, every day that goes by, whether we trust the governor or not, there is a posted cash deficit. I just walked over to the director and asked him what they were tracking for the month of March. It's at $5 million they anticipate. So we can cut, but it does nothing to address the cash shortfall. And I don't think that the administration is threatening anything. They're doing it. They've taken a 20% cut. They've reappropriated personnel throughout the district. They're threatening. This is a threat, but this, based on the track record, I fear that they're going to cut busing for other students. They're going to close rec centers in the evenings. They're even contemplating shutting down those organizations that are not in the so-called Group 1, which I agree is a priority. I guess my point, Mr. Chair, is that I'm really hoping to encourage my colleagues. I know a couple other senators last week, verbalized their intent to move forward, whether it's a sales tax or a BPT. All other 17 revenue enhancement strategies have merit. The governor and this body have put that forward and are on the table. But I think there's certain assurances that need to be made, whether it's a BPT or a sales tax or a combination thereof. I just would hate to see that we get wrapped around the axle of this one provision. Again, I don't stand in opposition to the good senator's recommendation and advocacy for the protection of indigenous rights through our culture and language. But I want to encourage us to look past that debate, that political process, in terms of establishing that. We can come back to that tomorrow if we pass a revenue generating bill today or the week after. I'm firmly opposed to the reorganization remaining solely in the hands of an executive agent. I agree with you. We can always address that again, but we're still not getting closer closer to adopting a revenue enhancement bill. And I'm afraid that we're going to pass the UGAN reorganization amendment and ultimately not get to where we need to be to pass Senator San Augustine's sales tax bill. So, I mean, no disrespect to my colleagues, especially the good senator to my right, who's been very strong in Chamorro advocacy, but I really want to encourage us to move forward, and let's have the discussion on the sales tax or the BPT or something that can get us that much closer to figuring out this cash crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. Senator Lee, and then Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have to agree with the sentiments of the previous two speakers. I think that no one here, not one person in this body can argue that education, health, and safety don't need those resources. We all know that DOE is usually about $100 million short of the amounts that they need. And even when we appropriate a certain amount, they end up not getting that cash. They end up not getting what's appropriated to them. And the same can be said for the Guam Memorial Hospital and our other health agencies, and public safety as well. So we're constantly being criticized and for not prioritizing our priorities. And this is an opportunity for us. And again, I want to reiterate what a previous speaker had said, that we really hope that the executive branch will agree and will prioritize these big three things first. And it's not to say that the other things aren't important, but we really need to keep our eye on the prize here and really maintain our focus so that we can figure out the best way out of this fiscal crisis in one that will really give us an opportunity and give all the people of Guam opportunities to grow and thrive on our island. Situs Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to add to some of my previous comments. First and foremost, it's good to hear that someone in the halls reiterated the issue about funding, and that we need to transition and get back to providing a funding mechanism for the operations of this government. But what's interesting, Mr. Chairman, is that our people have been crying for reorganization, cutting the red tape, and streamlining this government. On the one hand, we have a proposal with the amendment to reallocate it or reprioritize that amendment. It really comes down to prioritizing funding, Mr. Chairman. The commission is presently under the jurisdiction of the governor's office. It's codified by law. We are not removing that particular mandate. So the flexibility remains there for the governor to carry out that responsibility and the function of the Commission on Decolonization. It's looking at identifying ways in which we can realize some cost reduction, reorganize this government, cut the red tape, so that our people, when it comes to public safety, do not have to hear about a police precinct being shut down, do not have to hear about 2 fire stations being shut down, do not have to hear about any other cost-cutting measures that affect the areas of education, public safety, and healthcare. This really comes down to prioritizing funding. And if we're going to entertain a funding legislation without a corresponding reduction in expenses of this government, without giving the governor of Guam the flexibility to be able to reorganize this government so that we can realize some savings and some cost reduction for the balance of this fiscal year and moving forward, then that's not a balanced approach. The right approach is making sure that we refine and we understand exactly where the financial challenges are for this government, what is accessible, what the government is going to anticipate to receive, and in the same breath, give our people what they've been asking for, is a reorganized government that's going to realize some cost reduction, some savings that could otherwise be spent in education, public safety, and healthcare. That's what this legislation is about. So we can, this idea about being here for a number of days, It's our job. It's our job to make sure that, in fact, we give our people what they expect from us. And that is to find a funding source, but also to reorganize this government so that the focus is on the core functions of what the government of Guam should be providing. So, Mr. Chairman, I reiterate my opposition to the amendment, and I recognize that the mandate is still in place. This is about prioritizing funding for these particular entities so that the functions or the services, as critical as they are, continue to be carried out. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the Esteves amendment, there is an objection. And now there's no other discussion. Senator, would you like to close? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the discussion from my colleagues and again ask for their support in this amendment. And to be very clear, the amendment does not propose to move these two entities into priority group 1. What I'm doing does not supersede health, education, or public safety. So let me be very clear on that, Mr. Chairman. And now we understand things are codified. We hope. We're sitting here, the legislature, the third branch of government, hoping that the commission and the agency doesn't get abolished. Hoping. What a ridiculous concept in a deliberative body. We say we're here to set priorities. We're here to set funding. But what I'm looking at is a document. It's going to be a historical document that says the 34th Guam legislature is putting Chamorro issues as the lowest priority in this government. During the month of Mes Chamorro, no doubt. All I'm asking, Mr. Chairman, is that this body, I understand health, safety, education, our priorities. I got it. I support the amendment as a whole. But all I'm asking is that in the scraps that's left after the top 3, that we set a position in this body that says on the island of Guam, that promoting Chamorro culture is still important to this government. We look at the other priorities in Group 2, and I see it. But what would the Guam Visitors Bureau be promoting, if not Chamorro culture, to make us unique? Home of the brown tree snakes? Everything I understand is intrinsically entwined. And I understand that the governor should have the flexibility. But what I'm asking is, what is coming out of this body should not be a hope that the governor or next governor prioritizes these issues. What should be coming out of this body is that we prioritize these issues. And it's true. We could go around the axles and keep going around saying this is important, this is important. I understand. They are all important. But again, this is Guam, Mr. Chairman. You don't go to the Philippines, and I'll reiterate this. You don't go to the Philippines and expect that the promotion of Filipino culture is not a priority in the Philippines. You don't go to China, tell the Chinese government that Chinese culture is not important, or the people. And you don't go to Japan. You don't tell them Japanese culture and language and society is not important to the Japanese government. So once again, just as a matter of principle, whether they get the funding or not, that's up to this body to decide when we budget. But we need to decide as a body that we do prioritize these things. Maybe not over health, public safety, and education, but the 34th Guam legislature does prioritize Chamorro affairs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. On the Esteves amendment, there was an objection, so we'll now call for the vote. Yes. All those in favor of the, is there a point of order? A point of order, state your point of order, Senator.
As was raised in a previous conversation to I think the amendment that I proffered, number 108 is also not updated here for the Public Defender Service Corporation, to just a note for legal. Susmasi.
Okay, thank you. On the Esteves amendment, all those in favor, please signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you please raise your hands, clerk? Okay, motion fails. Senator Esteves, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this might have been passed out. Oh, I'm sorry, we're still on the Uggan amendment. That's all I have at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator. Anyone else on the Uggan amendment? Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just an observation that I wanted to discuss. If we reference 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Page 9, section 2209, implementing executive order. There's a section G there that reads abolition. And if you apply that section G to section 2213, special provision for elected officials. Section 2213, special provision for elected officials, basically exempts the abolition of elected offices or departments under the supervision of an elected official. But I think it's important for us to note under PN 200, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Guam International Airport Authority and the Guam Port Authority, they are not under an elected official. Those boards are appointed. And so I raise this as a point of concern, particularly because both of those entities have recently had and are currently in some serious litigation. Some of them are with respect to major settlements or major contracts. And I'm just concerned that if we were to enable those boards to be abolished and for those agencies to somehow be folded under the administrative authority of Imagalayan Guahan, just a single individual, they may be able to order settlement of some of these major cases. And that might not be in the best interests of the people of Guam. And so I wanted to raise this as a concern. Perhaps we should entertain an amendment to include language that would exempt any reorganizations from impacting any ongoing litigation, so that it wouldn't be a tool to bypass the due process or the judicial process in the event that there's some kind of issue that goes before the courts. So I just wanted to raise that with respect to this amendment, and if there's no one else that's going to be having any discussions, or unless there can be some clarification of my concern, I'd like an opportunity to work with legal counsel to draft.
Just a point of information, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to the concern of the good senator. you take a look at Section 10, the transition, it has a provision that nothing contained herein shall be construed to affect proceedings begun or action taken prior to the effective date of this act. So it does address existing or ongoing contractual obligations slash ongoing legal proceedings. Section 10, titled Transition. So I hope that that particular provision addresses the good senator's concern. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I could ask the author to reference, is this 2210, section 2210, or?
It's on the last page, Senator,
Last page.
on section 10.
Oh, I see. I can understand how that would impact existing litigations, but anything in the future might still become a concern. If there's any kind of lawsuits, or let's say, for example, one of these issues that are existing are somehow settled or abated and then reinitiated, it would technically be after this act. So I would like an opportunity to work with counsel to perhaps exclude items in litigation, or maybe in the civil service, perhaps even.
Okay, thank you, Senator. We'll come back to you then. Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, because the previous speaker brought up International Airport and Port Authority, both autonomous. What happened to GPA and GWA that are autonomous? Why aren't they being part of this package? You know, you add one autonomous, they should be the same. I'm just curious, because they got a lot of money.
Is that a question for the mover?
Yes.
Senator Uga, would you yield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that question. And that's primarily because the people of Guam have a direct influence on the selection of the Consolidated Commission on Utilities members. So it is an elected body and is separate and apart from the consideration in this proposal. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Tamada?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got two questions. One is on the group 2, we have the Office of Public Accountability, which is overseen and supervised by an elected official. So is it appropriate then to place the Office of Public Accountability under any of these groups? Since we did say in 2213 that the provisions and illicit amount shall not apply to an office or department under the supervision of an elected official. So I guess that's my first question, including then the OPA under one of the groupings, and 2213 seem to be inconsistent or contradictory.
Senator Uga, would you yield?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for that question. First of all, it does recognize that it's an elected office, which you had mentioned, and this particular provision will not apply to that, but primarily because the Office of Public Accountability provides executive branch or carries out executive branch related functions. That's one of the reasons why it was incorporated here. But that provision 2213 for elected officials shall not apply to an office or department under the supervision of an elected official certainly would exempt the Office of Public Accountability from being reorganized under this provision.
Senator Ada?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. You have to speak closer into the mic, Senator. And slower.
Thank you very much, Senator. In this case, I alluded to what you just referenced, the Section 2213, special provision for elected officials. The Office of Public Accountability was inclusive of the listing primarily because of the nature of the activities and the functions that it carries out. But that section 22113, where it reads shall not apply to an office or department under the supervision of an elected official, would exempt that office from reorganization by the governor. So it does recognize that it's an elected office. It was included here by virtue of the functions that he carries out, executive branch-wise, and certainly this provision exempts it from any reorg under this provision.
So in that case, Mr. Chairman, then it seems appropriate then to delete the OPA as well as the Department of Law since that particular agency is headed up by an elected official from this listing. I mean, it just removes any confusion. So my motion would be to delete 201 and 202 from the Group 2 listing, and to delete those two entries
Okay.
and renumber the rest.
All right, thank you, Senator Ada. On the Ada amendment to delete those two items, Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, and I'd ask that they amend on his listing that would add the Department of Education, because they're also run by the elected board, island-wide. They also be added on that list.
So that's an amendment, to the Ada amendment to delete Department of Law.
I would have to, Mr. Chairman, if I may, oppose the second amendment to the amendment, only because being mindful of the provision that one of our colleagues had proffered, the reallocation of any appropriation will go to priority agencies, inclusive of the Department of Education. So if we were to extract Department of Education from this listing, then as priority group 1, then certainly that may prohibit the transfer of any additional savings that are realized as a result of reorganization towards that priority agency. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Argan. We have to dispose of Senator Ada's amendment first, because that was two amendments. That was to delete the Department of Law, as well as the Office of the Public Accountability. So we'll go with the Ada amendment first, and then we'll come back to Senator San
Okay, I was
Augustine.
going to withdraw mine.
Yes, okay, you'll withdraw that. On the Ada amendment, are there any discussions or any objections? No objections, no discussions, motion carries. Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
I still got
I'm
one
sorry, Senator Ada, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have concerns about including in this list the International Airport Authority and the Port Authority, simply because these two agencies, in particular right now, the Airport Authority has entered into a bond covenant with lenders, and I'm sure that those covenants are pretty tight about, you know, changing anything that has been agreed to include the organizational setup. In the case of the Port Authority of Guam, although right now they are in the process of obtaining, going to the bond market. So because of the bond covenants that these two autonomous agencies go into, I would also move to delete those two autonomous agencies from this list.
Thank you, Senator Ada. On the Ada amendment to delete the airport and the port, Senator Nelson, did you have any discussions?
Can the proffer of the amendment restate why he would like to delete the port from the list?
Senator,
I
would you
didn't catch
restate
that,
that?
I'm
Would
sorry.
you?
Sure. When these autonomous agencies go to the bond market to borrow money for their capital improvement projects, they enter into a bond covenant which, in many of those covenants, stipulates that the government will not go in there and make changes to the organization or changes that in any way may jeopardize or affect the ability of that organization to make good on the loans that it has taken out. And so that is why, you know, you would find provisions in those covenants that says, you know, government of Guam, stay arm's length from these agencies, and because if you put if they get, they just want to assure that we don't go in making changes that may jeopardize the organization's ability to make good on the loans that it has obtained.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Um, Respectfully, I object. We, at least with the port, because throughout the weeks we've heard the impact of bond covenants that our autonomous agencies, the impacts that the bond covenants have on towards the government with our autonomous agencies. Mr. Rojas presented us with the letter, which basically says, in reference to GWA, GPA, Airport Authority, that essentially these covenants that they entered into, these indentures that they entered into, prohibits them from contributing back to the general fund. And the Port Authority hasn't received a bond yet. And I think it's part of the body's responsibility, especially during this financial crisis, during this dire time, that we start paying attention to what these bond covenants that the agencies, or bond indentures that the agencies go into, and how it impacts the government as a whole. And so now we're faced with, okay, GWA, we can't pull from the system development charge that they haven't touched for many years because of this bond covenant. GPA, the same thing. Airport Authority, it's a similar thing. So really, it causes these bond covenants, these bond indentures, causes more of a hindrance for our government, our general fund, than it does for anything. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. We raise the power costs, we raise the water costs. Most of it, of course, is LEAC, but at the same time, within the agencies, they, instead of having to give back into the general fund, they find a capital improvement project and say, or we have to raise a surcharge so that they can give back into the government, which is ridiculous. It's like a, it's almost like a, it's like a scare tactic. Well, we owe the general fund $3 million, but we have to increase surcharge. And so the legislature, they back off because, oh, we don't want to see an increase in rates. But they're okay with raising tariffs or raising other charges so that, you know, we can have pay increases within autonomous agencies. It's like we look the other way on how they're functioning and what they're doing, but they are still responsible to the people of Guam and to this government. And I feel that if we take out the port at this time, you know, we're basically giving them, what's this word I'm hearing a lot lately, carte blanche on whatever they want to do. And so I'd have to respectfully object that we take out the port. They're still a government agency. Yes, they're autonomous, but we need to pay more attention in what these bond indentures mean to the people of Guam. Last year, we approved them to get a bond, even without a specific plan for their residential commercial lease building. It was just a number thrown out there. There was no formula put in place. There was no blueprint design. But we said, okay, you get an X amount of millions of dollars to go to the bond for this, even though we didn't see the clear picture. Now, GPA, they're doing their parts where they have a blueprint for the power plant, or the combined cycle. They know the cost, they know the revenue generation. But the port was a different story, and I've yet to see further documentation regarding this. And so I humbly, respectfully object to the ports. I mean, there's nothing we can really do with the Airport Authority. They've already went into this indenture, but at this time I don't agree to to exclude the port from this listing.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. There's an objection. Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see the logic of the mover of the amendment, and I think that perhaps a master amendment to just basically cover all bond indentures and all legally binding contracts and covenants shall not be impacted by any actions undertaken as a result of this act. I think that should be like maybe a master amendment. I like the idea of keeping all of these agencies on the table, only because there may be things within the agencies that we may want to consider reorganizing eventually. There may be duplicated services or duplicated functions that by consolidating them, we can actually improve how everything operates. So I think keeping them on the table is a good idea. Someone mentioned also putting other agencies on the table that aren't on the list. And I think we need to put into perspective what this amendment, the master amendment, the overall amendment is going to do. It's going to set the parameters for reorganization, not just today, but in the future. And if in the future, for example, we were to repeal a board or the constitution of an agency were to no longer be autonomous or no longer be semi-autonomous, but they're not on this list, then they would be floating out there. So I think having them in these lists somewhere is a good thing, and then writing in the sections to create the exemptions for any particular areas of concern is a good idea. So I would just like to put as a point of information, perhaps we should instead have a master amendment addressing covenants and contracts, similar to having a master amendment addressing making sure that we're not going to be affecting any litigation. Just a suggestion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. On the ADA amendment, are there anyone else who wish to discuss the amendment? If not, Senator Ada, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the senator from Dedido, I guess, I think she was making reference about the law on the payment in lieu of taxes, and that how many of these agencies either have not paid into the till, or when they agree to do so, they go to the Public Utilities Commission and request for authorization to establish a surcharge to be able to pay for that. And I think that the problem is not because the agency, those autonomous agencies don't want to contribute to the government, more so than how the law is written. So if one actually takes the time to go in and read how the pilot law, payment in lieu of taxes, is written, it says that these agencies have to pay out of the excess revenues that they have generated. And these guys never have excess revenues because they have more capital improvement projects that are needed than they generally have revenues to be able to support those projects. So I don't think it's so much a not wanting to contribute, more so than take a look at how the law is written. And if you want to change that, then you go in and you change the law. Second thing is that while it is true that the port has not yet gone into the bond market to borrow the hundreds of millions of dollars that the water, that GWA and GPA and the airport have already done, they are in the process of doing that. But let's not overlook the fact that they already have taken out millions of dollars of loans from the bank. The only difference between the loan and the bond is that the loan has a shorter term payback period. They also have loans with Bank of Guam. They have loans with USDA. So, they're on the hook. And finally, this thing about, they can go out there willy-nilly and just increase the rates so that they can give themselves pay raises. Let's not forget that.
Point of
I'm
personal
not finished
privilege.
yet, Mr. Chairman.
There's a point of order, Senator, if she may state your point of order.
Please, if I never said willy-nilly, like it's something that they just blow in the wind. So
Okay.
I'd like to ask that that would be refrained, because that's certainly not the case.
Okay, thank you.
She
Senator,
wants me to take back willy-nilly? Okay, I'll take back willy-nilly. But this matter of, raising rates so that they can give themselves pay raises is really a cheap shot. Because whenever the utilities have to go out there and raise rates, those petitions have to be scrutinized closely by a third party, the Public Utilities Commission, which this body created for that very purpose. So, they're not as free as we would like to think that they are. Everybody's looking over everybody's shoulders. And finally, this idea about, we really need to start taking a look at the bond covenants that these autonomous agencies enter into. Let's not forget that old saying that he who holds the gold rules. So if you want to borrow hundreds of millions of dollars from the bond market, then the bond market normally sets those parameters. And if we don't like it, then we don't borrow it, and we don't undertake the capital improvements that we want to undertake. So let's just, I just want to make those sort of things clear, and not set ourselves up for anything that just makes it more difficult further down the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. On the Ada amendment to delete the Port Authority and the airport, there is an objection. So all those in favor of the Ada amendment, please signify by raising your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Motion fails. Senator Ada, you still have the floor. Thank you very much, Senator Ada. So we're still on the Uggan amendment, and if I may, colleagues, if I may ask if that on the amendments moving forward, if we can have one go around by each of the senators, just to help move things along. I know we've been very flexible, but if I may request that we have one go around on each amendment. Okay. Senator Espadon, are you ready with your amendment?
Yes, I don't have it printed out, but under the guidance of legal counsel, this would be pertinent to section 2211. And the issue was, bottom line, the abolishment of an entity, and the people would be terminated within 60 days. What I would like to do, and I'll look to you to whether you want to have it printed or not, but really what it would be is, it's under 211, it reads, an abolished entity shall be closed and all remaining personnel terminated within 60 days of the day the entity was designated as an abolished entity, period. And what I would like to do is make an amendment, is that after the term within 60 days of the, strike out the words day the entity was designated as an abolished entity, and in its place use the words date of implementation of the executive order effectuating the abolition. And so we can keep the 60 days because under section 2207 it addresses the issue of the administrative rules under 2207A, subsection A, and that really addresses the issue, the reorganization directed by the executive orders shall be accomplished in accordance with the procedures for promulgating rules set out in 5 GCA sections 9301 and 9303. And that, in essence, is the AAA process for rules and regulations. And that is a 90-day provision under the rules and regulations. So, just by changing those words, we're still consistent with AAA process, but it'll be also 60 days after if we abolish an entity. So the amendment would read, an abolished entity shall be closed and all remaining personnel terminated within 60 days of the date of implementation of the executive order effectuating the abolition. And that was with help and guidance from legal counsel. I can have that printed if you'd like.
I think that's fine, Senator. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does every senator understand the amendment? Any discussion on the amendment? Senator Lee?
Just a point of inquiry, Mr. Chair, if the mover of the amendment will yield. Is this with regards to any agency that is potentially abolished, or are we specifically talking about autonomous agencies with outstanding debt?
No, this is within any agencies because Section 2211 of this entire amendment, which was really introduced as a bill, basically speaks to all the agencies that are on the list. And so if there is going to be an abolition of any of those agencies, then really this applies to each one of those agencies in priority lists 1 through 3.
Thank you, Senator. On the Espadon amendment, are there any other discussions? There are no objections to the Espadon amendment? Sorry, Vice Speaker, did you have a? Okay. Senator, may you please repeat the amendment again?
Sure. The amendment would be to strike after the words 60 days of the, after that phrase, then strike the word day the entity was designated as an abolished entity. You strike 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 words, and replace it with the phrase date of implementation of the executive order effectuating the abolition.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Are there any objections? There are no objections to the amendment. Motion carries. Thank you,
Thank
Senator.
you.
Thank you. Senator San Augustine, you had a, okay, you're fine. Are there any other discussions on the Ogden amendment? Senator San Nicolas had a amendment. Okay. Anyone else have any amendment? Well, okay, we'll take a 1-minute recess. The Committee of the Whole is now back on. We're waiting for Senator San Nicolas for his amendment to be printed. While we wait, Senator Esteves, you asked to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the opportunity during the recess to discuss with my colleagues, and I'm going to be asking for a motion to reconsider a previous question with the intent to divide that question. I believe, and after consulting with my colleagues, that the question previously posed whether to move to the Commission on Decolonization and Chamorro Affairs from Priority Group 3 to Priority Group 2 would have been better served had the question been divided. So at this time, I'd like to make the motion to reconsider that vote with the intent to divide the question into two separate motions.
Okay. Are there any objections to the motion to reconsider? No objections? Okay, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'd like to make the motion to divide the question on whether we're moving Commission of Decolonization to Priority Group 2 and Chamorro Affairs to Group 2. So if my colleagues would allow, I would like to divide the question into two separate amendments.
Go ahead and state your amendment.
Well, I would like to see if I'm allowed to divide the motion first, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you may.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to withdraw the motion to move Commission of Decolonization from Priority Group 3 to Priority Group 2 with the understanding that it's funded and supported out of the governor's office, for the most part separate and apart from the general fund, overall general fund appropriation. And I'd like to move forward with the single amendment and the motion to move Chamorro Affairs from Priority Group 3 to Priority Group 2. The rationale about this, Mr. Chairman, to move that one agency is that looking at what the intent of the amendment is to reorganize and restructure government to be more efficient, having an overarching agency such as Department of Chamorro Affairs able to either absorb or reprioritize more efficiently the efforts of other related agencies in Priority Group 3. I think in order to do that and to establish the hierarchy within the agencies to promote reorganization, we have to move the agency as a priority of the government, one singular head, as we determined by this body, to now be and act as the overarching authority. So I ask my colleagues to consider voting on this measure for all the previously stated reasons with regards to the priorities set by this body on the importance of indigenous culture here on the island. And furthermore, the reason that I believe it's important that it's set by this body is because there was an amendment previously pushed by a member of this body and which ultimately failed, which was to provide additional protections for the abolishment of agencies, primarily those existing in Priority Group 3. So I feel it's very important that we move it up to Priority Group 2 because that motion failed and because the governor has a lot of power. Would potentially have a lot of power moving forward with the amendment for reorganization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. So the amendment is to move Department of Chamorro Affairs from Group 3 and move it up to Group 2. On the amendment, Senator Tom Adda.
You know, with all the discussion about the importance of indigenous rights and all that, we shouldn't go halfway. I think we should go take it from Group 3 and put it into Group 1. So that's my motion.
I have no objection to the amendment.
Okay, so the amendment to the amendment now is, instead of removing Department of Chamorro Affairs, moving it up to Group 2, it is moving it up to Group 1. Any discussions on the amendment to the amendment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and with all due respect to the mover of the amendment to the amendment, by virtue of transitioning Department of Chamorro Affairs to Group 2, then that would be the entity that would be absorbing any additional functions or services from Group 3, if in fact that's the desire of the governor. So I believe that the original motion is sufficient to be able to address it, primarily because we're talking about funding mechanism. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is that an objection, Senator? No. Okay. So any other discussion? Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I know that the Department of Chamorro Affairs has many divisions within it, and I'm not sure who is the overall chairman, the oversight chairman of Chamorro Affairs, but if they could kind of elaborate what divisions fall under the Department of Chamorro Affairs, just to fully understand, because there might be some divisions within there that could be and should be reorganized, or perhaps even, So bottom line, I just was wondering, whoever is in charge, has oversight, if they could just kind of break it down of what falls on the Chamorro Affairs, because I believe CAHA does, and several other entities. And so if we can just at least get an enumeration of that, then it'd be easier to make the determination.
Madam Vice Speaker, would you yield?
Yes, I would. Thank you for the question. By statute, the Department of Chamorro Affairs has a mandate to take care of to run the Chamorro Village, the museum, by executive order. I mean, of course, it has its own mandates just within the department of, for language translation and many other things. But by executive order, it's also been, other duties have been consolidated to it already, including public libraries and CAHA, and I can't remember all of them, but I know also it takes care of the KGTF PBS. It's under that lineup, and there were others on this list also that actually fall under the Department of Chamorro Affairs. Right now, the Hagatna Restoration Redevelopment Authority, I think, was also included in that executive order. Those are the others on this list. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that enumeration. There might be a few others, and I just remember receiving a letter from a former president, and that's the title of the Department of Chamorro Affairs, and alongside of his letterhead, he had, there were more titles and responsibilities than there was space to even write the letter. And so, just by some of the entities that were enumerated by the oversight chair of Chamorro Affairs, I mean, now we're talking the Guam Museum, the public libraries, CAHA, KGTF, Hagatna Redevelopment. I'm not sure that those are necessarily priority number one. And only because if you take a look, I mean, if we start going down this road, if you take a look at the present listing right now, the present listing does have the Hagatna Restoration and Redevelopment under priority number 3. We also have the Guam Museum under priority level number 3, and there may be more. I'm not comfortable with moving up to a number 1 priority, because when you start talking all those subdivisions under the Department of Chamorro Affairs, that maybe some of those could be and should be reorganized or rethought. I don't think that has to be, those subdivisions have to be untouchable. So I have to object at this point with respect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw my motion.
Okay, okay, so you're withdrawing. Are there any objections to the withdrawal? No objections? Okay. So we're still on the Esteves amendment to move the Department of Chamorro Affairs from Group 3 to Group 2. So that's what's before us now. Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Chairman, with all the discussion about what does Chamorro Affairs consist of, can we get a true write-up? And the reason why I ask that is because when I heard Senator Spaldon brought up public libraries, that's under my committee. She has a certain portion, and under DOE, you have a Chamorro Studies program. It's a big part of DOE. So I'm just curious, what is the listing of what covers Chamorro affairs? Because if they're listed to the Guam Museum and everything, then they need to merge now, not wait and then piecemeal this to category 200 or whatever. Okay, we got to make sense of this listing, because I thought the listing was a good listing, and if it's a mix-up of other agencies, then we need to merge them now and be done with it.
Mr. Chair, as I said earlier, by statute, many of these are independent. However, by a prior executive order, they have been kind of merged under this administration, under the authority of Department of Chamorro Affairs, but they continue to exist independently, such as the public libraries and their jurisdiction under the legislature's another completely separate. But by statute, I think many of these, CAHA, the public libraries, they all exist independently. However, by executive order, I'm just pointing out that some of these have been consolidated under, the management of the Department of Chamorro Affairs. That's all. But of course, the Department of Chamorro Affairs has its mandates, Mr. Chair, and there are quite a few of them. There are actually at least 2 boards that govern different functions of the Department of Chamorro Affairs, and it's a public corporation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Senator, did that
I would still like to see the
list?
listing.
Okay.
So to make sure that, that was mentioned, Guam Museum is there, and exactly what Senator Spaldon says, we moved Chamorro Affairs, we got museum there. I'm making me look now at all this list and seeing what else is here. Is
Okay.
it part of the governors, it's just
So
a bunch
we'll-
of stuff.
Chair, if
we'll
I
get a
may,
listing.
yeah, it's the issue with the list. Or this list, takes some functions of some agencies and puts them into priority 3 versus the agency itself remains in priority 1 or 2. If you notice that, I think we have to admit that this list is not perfect. It's not, and it's either we go with that or we're going to spend hours or days perfecting this list. I think not just the priorities, but the divisions that have been stated here. So I would assume it has to be a work in progress, because you can see they've divided up the Department of Youth Affairs, for example. Group 3, Department of Youth Affairs, includes non-custodial and non-corrections related functions of the Department of Youth Affairs, versus Part 2 has the custodial part of Department of Youth Affairs. So, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. So, Senator, we'll get you whatever information you need, but we'll move on for now. Thank you. Senator Lee?
Yeah, just as a point of information, in addition to what the Vice Speaker had mentioned, the previous speaker had mentioned, I had sent a message to all senators. This was provided via messages and communications, and that's the Department of Chamorro Affairs Citizen-Centric Report. So everybody can just maybe take a moment to view that. It talks about their mission, how many employees they have, and all of the different points of performance and different entities within Department of Chamorro Affairs, just so we're all on the same page. Suzus Masi.
Thank you very much, Senator, for that information. On the Esteves Amendment, are there any other discussions? Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this conversation and this amendment in particular, it's representative of how, because it's called Chamorro Affairs, everybody wants to just jump up and say that they're protecting what's Chamorro by doing something about it. But let's look at it really for what it is. And when you look at the components of it, the majority of what it's doing is not very specific to the Chamorro people. In the sections here, there are certain parts here that do talk about it. It talks about the Chamorro language and culture, the divisions of Chamorro language and culture, research, publication, and training. And then it talks about the Chamorro village, and the Chamorro village, it's called the Chamorro village, but let's be realistic. The Guam Museum, and that's a valuable asset in its own right, just for being a museum. And then you have the Hagatnya Restoration and Redevelopment Authority, CAHA, the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities, the Guam Public Library System, and KGTF, the Guam Educational Telecommunications Corporation. This is an example of why we need to pass this bill, and we need to pass it as is. Because otherwise, let's just reorganize, or let's just have an executive order that puts everything under Chamorro Affairs, then all of a sudden, let's not touch it because it's under the agency that has the word, the Chamorro word in it. You know, this kind of policy making where it's going to be just playing on sensitivities is a disservice to our people, because we have real needs that we need to address that's going to strengthen our community, and I think that those are the things that we should be focusing on, rather than trying to make it look like we're trying to somehow be a protector of something that really is not what it's labeled as. Now, if we want to make sure that the Chamorro language and culture is going to continue to be a priority, I'd like to reference the fact that it's public law that we teach Chamorro in our schools. If someone wants to introduce a public law to continue to emphasize that the language and the culture needs to be protected in certain ways, then absolutely. But let's not pretend that this agency is somehow some kind of Chamorro fortress that we're going to be deprioritizing in the history books by the passage of this amendment. Or we can put Chamorro in the front of every single agency, and then no one's going to want to touch it because it's the Chamorro Regional Transit Authority, or the Chamorro Energy Office, or the Chamorro Election Commission. Let's make sure that we are being very, very clear to our people about what it is that we're trying to do, and not just make it be all about our cultural sensitivities, because while I acknowledge that we always need to be mindful of that, we also need to make sure that as policymakers, we're not just getting swept away by that. So I echo the objection to the amendment, or if this amendment as it's being proffered hasn't been objected to, I object to it in its current form. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. There is an objection to this Davis amendment. All those in favor?
I'd like to close. Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I understand there are a lot of already, by executive order, overarching responsibility of Chamorro's affairs. And I just want to be very clear that my intent is not to shield any agency from reorganization and efficiency. Let me be very clear and reiterate that. It's not to shield anybody from reorganization or measures for efficiency. If we know how law works, Mr. Chairman, these agencies exist under itself. Because the governor did an executive order, we just say, well, it happened once, this is the reason why. No, we're gonna have a new governor. But the law is very clear. These are separate agencies. If one governor reorganized them or did an executive order to reprioritize it under his authority, then he did so. But we're not here to make determinations of what they do. We're here to make determinations and deliberate on what we do and the policy that we set with our own goals in mind. And all I'm asking is that moving forward, we keep this in mind. That's all. If we were to reorganize Chamorro Affairs into 10 people with a small mandate, that would be fine if the mission got accomplished, the core mission. But I think establishing them as priority 2 alongside with Department of Military Affairs and Department of Veteran Affairs, I think is important. There's a huge difference between having cultural sensitivity and having no cultural sensitivity. I would like to remind this body that this is the island of Guam, the ancestral homeland of the Chamorro people. It's not about playing on if I was a policymaker in a Native American reserve, you better believe I think Native affairs was important. Or if I'm in Hawaii, Hawaii has Native affairs. That's what makes us unique, Mr. Chairman. This is not about playing on the politics of it. This government, as long as it's the government of Guam, has a responsibility to the island, to its people, and to its indigenous people. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we have to pay for it. I'm sorry taxpayers have to pay for it. But that comes with living on Guam. That comes with living on an island that had people here for thousands of years. Now we bear that burden of that responsibility. That's just a matter of fact. At least as I believe it. Others may not believe it. Others believe that when times get tough, cut the easy stuff. But it's what we do in moments like this when we set priorities to say that even though times are tough, this is still an important issue for us. That's what makes a leader, Mr. Chairman. It's easy to chase the buck. It's easy to use money as a reason not to do things or to do things. But what do we stand on? And that's what I ask. That's what I'm asking for in this amendment, Mr. Chairman, is what is the 34th Guam legislature going to stand on? I'm not proposing, the amendment was not to move Chamorro Affairs and their mandates on language and culture into priority group 1. I didn't object to it. But I think the compromise here is saying that at least let's put it on par with some of the other agencies that we believe and departments that we believe is important. And how the reorganization goes at the executive level to make it more efficient can still happen, because all of these agencies currently under them that exist in priority group 3 exist separate and alone in statute. What the governor does, we can't make him change his executive orders. So again, I ask my colleagues to please support this amendment.
Thank you, Senator. On the amendment to place Department of Chamorro Affairs from Group 3 to Group 2, there was an objection. All those in favor, please signify by raising your hands. Motion passes. Senator?
Thank you. That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And I thank the body.
Thank you. We now have Senator San Nicolas' amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been circulated. The amendment, we did not put the section number. I guess we'll just go ahead and leave that to legal counsel. The amendment reads, any reorganization authorized by this act shall not affect any ongoing administrative or judicial proceeding involving any agency, instrumentality, or public corporation.
Okay, on the San Nicolas amendment, are there any discussions? Any objections? Are there no objections?
Mr. Chair, can you just give us a moment to
Okay, sure.
digest this?
Okay, we're back on. Senator Nelson, did you have any questions? Okay, on the St. Nicholas Amendment, Senator Espaldon, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of what the mover of the amendment is trying to do, and that's basically to make sure that if there are any judicial proceedings, and in this one it actually said administrative proceedings involving any agency, instrumentality, or public corporations, then the reorganization should not affect any of those. I guess it's such broad language that I do have some concern. In that, if there is an administrative proceeding in one agency that might be related to issues in another agency, and that other agency is being looked at to be reorganized, then it can't, because whatever actions may have been attributable to the administrative or judicial proceedings of the first agency, of the second agency, then affects the first agency. I know that's not very clear, but bottom line, if there is an administrative or judicial proceeding that's happening in court affecting, let's say, agency 1, and yet a reorganization or abolition of agency 2 is necessary, then technically, by this language, you can't do anything to agency number 2 because it affects the proceedings, whether it be administrative or judicial, in agency 1. And it's a very fine line, but when it comes down to it, the interpretation can be made that way down the road. And so it's a very broad statement, and I know what the author is trying to do. However, it may then negate the ability of the governor or the ability to reorganize one agency only because its actions affect the administrative or judicial proceedings of another agency. And perhaps that's an argument that I need to run by legal counsel, because it would be a legal argument down the road. That's my concern. I'm not objecting to it, but I have a concern that because it's so broad and perhaps even vague, without due consideration for agencies that need to be reorganized, but it can't be because it affects the administrative and judicial proceedings of another agency, that reorganization cannot take place. That's the problem. I state it as a concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Perhaps on his closing, we can ask the Senator Mover to explain and hopefully provide some clarity if that's okay.
I would appreciate that, but also I would like to have at least a moment to speak with legal counsel to see if that really is a concern, because if it is, then we would need to reword this. And I don't want to proceed to the closing arguments of this amendment, to the amendment, without at least addressing it or at least running it by legal.
Okay.
So
Okay.
if I may take a minute to at least
Okay.
run it by?
Sure. And
Thank
then maybe
you.
we can go on to if there were anybody else that wish to discuss. Are there any other senators that wish to provide a discussion on the St. Nicholas Amendment? Senator San Augustine, did you have a
Mr.
Motion.
Chairman, I think it's important to find out what the results are from Senator Spaldon's discussion with legal, because I want to know actually what are some of the impacts of this. And if it's going to take a few more minutes, just looking at the time, maybe you might want to recess for lunch and then come back
Okay,
at 2
that's
o'clock.
that's a good suggestion. So we'll recess and we'll come back at 2. But I want to ask our colleagues if you can, we have, after the Uggan Amendment, we have 5 more amendments from Senator San Augustine and Senator Esteves on the main bill. I ask that if you can, anyone else have any amendments Senator Ogden also has two, to please provide that and have it ready. Okay, and there's also other amendments, if you can have that ready, so when we do come back at 2, we can proceed to close the Ogden amendment and then move on to the bill itself. Okay, so a motion to recess till 2 p.m. Any objections? So ordered. Thank you.